Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2015 Royal Tyrrell Museum Speaker Series. Today, the Royal Tyrrell Museum and its cooperating society are very pleased to welcome our very own Miss Marcy Belva. Marcy is a science educator here at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. Marcy is originally from the town of Rocky Rapids in Alberta. She obtained her undergraduate degree in biological sciences at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. Throughout her undergrad years, Marcy worked during the summer at the Royal Tyrrell Museum, where she held various roles, working in admissions, in the prep lab, but predominantly in the science education department. After completing her bachelor's degree, Marcy was hired full-time as a science educator here at the museum. Recently, Marcy completed a master's degree in museum studies from the University of Leicester in the UK. For her thesis, she studied the involvement of the Encana Badlands Science Camp participants in gathering data on Mylodaphus teeth for Dr. Michael Newbrae's research. Over the years, Marcy wishes to continue her career in museum interpretation and education and wants to find new ways of educating the public, especially children, about science. Today, Marcy will present the results of her study of the Encana Badlands Science Camp participation in scientific research. So without further delay, I present you Miss Marcy Belva.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to my talk. So my presentation is going to be about my master's research, but I also thought this was a good way just to showcase this excellent project that is happening here at the museum and show people that we are involving young people and the public in scientific research, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to be I was looking at the benefits of this project, which I'll explain more about it in a moment, but also some of the problems that could have arisen from having kids measuring data and from involving them actually in the research process. So the reason why I decided to study this is when I started working in science education, I then decided to pursue my master's degree in museum studies, and I really wanted to find ways of inspiring people to learn more about science, maybe get involved in science. And during my research, there were some things that I noticed in certain studies, things about a lack of sort of scientific literacy in the general public. People believing, for example, that scientists might distort data, and these are kids in high school believed things like that too, or that there's nothing new in science, so there's not any new things to be learned, that we're just sort of repeating the same things. So I think it would be nice to sort of expand the knowledge of the scientific process in general. And also one thing that I noticed in my own education and then in researching it and talking to kids, that a lot of times in school, even up until the beginnings of people's undergraduate degrees, the labs that they're performing are things with a definite result and the same thing over and over again and not any sort of novel discovery. So actually getting kids involved in the scientific process and learning what real research is like, I thought was really important. And so this program that got started here at the museum is something that seems entirely unique, so there's not really anywhere else that has a program quite like this one, and I'll talk a bit about why that is too. And then about the benefits that this offers to the people participating in it, but also to the scientists. So in a science like paleontology, there isn't always huge sample sizes, so if you're studying a large dinosaur or something, there's not always a lot of fossil material for it. But in this case, the children that are participating are looking at microfossils, so tiny fossils, which we have thousands of. And if they can collect a bunch of data for it, then the scientists can use that. And so it's a faster way of getting that data. So my thesis, what it involved, I did some background research and compared programs similar to this one at other museums and universities and things, even though there's not really a definite one to compare it to. And I also conducted some interviews. So I talked with the participants of the program, so the science camp kids who participated in this, and also some staff here at the museum and the camp counselors and the camp coordinator to discuss how this worked. And then I did a little bit of analysis of the data that the young people have collected but that work is still kind of ongoing. And then talked a bit about what could be done in the future to expand this project or just to make it better. So the idea of citizen science isn't something new. So involving people in the scientific process has happened at other places and with other research. And I really think it's important to involve people in the scientific process and get them actually involved and so they can learn about it. Because one of the issues I see with science is that it's not always accessible to people, at least not seeing academic journals and things like that. The public doesn't have access to those. Even students don't always have access to all published scientific research. So getting them actually right in the thick of it, then they can learn that there is this actually going on. And in terms of citizen science projects that have happened and things you might know about, things like bird counts. So the Audubon Society does a bird count, and so there'll be people that count birds, and they actually use this research for, and it has been used to publish articles and learn things about declining bird species and things like that. So it's a way to get more data by including a whole bunch of people to collect it for you. Other projects, there's a Coral Watch project that the University of Queensland does in Australia, and they had about 1,300 people looking at coral reefs, and they would go to their reefs that were nearby and look if there was any color changes in the reefs. And then they also learned from this what the causes of coral bleaching were and the effects of that. And there's also been a few projects that have involved children. And one of the things that I hoped to learn from this and hoped to convey was that children can be involved in research and can do really well with this. And it has happened before. So there's been studies with, for example, there was one in Washington where students were counting different tree species and also looking at, they were comparing sort of the numbers of rare and other types of species and things, and doing some measurements of the trees. So the children did a pretty good job with the measuring and things. It's mostly just with the, with the morphological stuff. So if they had to look at the shape of a leaf to decide if something was, they didn't always do well with that. But if it's strictly measurements, they can do that pretty well. And also one thing with children, they wanted to find a bunch of the rare species. They knew this one was rare, so they would actually overcount those. If they had like a segment of land they were counting in, they would say that there was more of a rare species than there actually was. So they wanted to sort of get the right answer and have more of that because they thought that was important. And so teaching them that it's more about the quality and that even if something isn't what you think should be the right answer, that it's what is actually happening is important. So a big thing that seemed to be a problem in some of these was the project had to be really well designed and there has to be quality control. So there has to be a way of knowing that the data you're getting is usable. And that seemed pretty easy to do. So most of these projects, the data that was collected was very accurate. So even the ones involving children as young as in like grade 3, their data was very comparable to data collected by experts. So they are capable of doing it. But you needed to still do checking of the data and also have really good training. So if they weren't properly trained what to look for, then of course they're going to make mistakes. So even though this can save time in some ways, you still need someone involved along the way to monitor the project and to help train the people and things like that. So some of the projects and things that happen around the world that also are similar to what we were doing, but not quite the same. There was a project started in the United States called National Lab Day. And in that one, they pair STEM scientists, so scientists or researchers, I should say. So people who work in science or technology or math, and they would pair them with teachers, and then they develop a project for their students to study. And so the kids would kind of work with it and get to develop their own research project to study. So kind of similar. Another one, there's a series of, in the United States as well, and Invent Now camps, and about 90,000 kids have participated in those. And those ones, they get to build something, so they might be building a project or conducting some sort of experiment, so they're actually doing their own research. Another thing was at the Children's Research Center, they have been giving kids the skills to actually conduct their own research. So teaching them the process of going through it, and they've actually published articles with the research children have done. So again, very capable of doing these things. And then there's also camps and courses that universities and colleges offer. So students, usually like high school students, can go and spend a week at a university, meet with a researcher, maybe complete a little project, that sort of thing. So these are kind of similar to what we were doing, but ours is different in that ours isn't a project that the kids are completing themselves. We're actually contributing to active research that's going on that could be published. And we're here at a museum, so it's a bit of a different atmosphere sometimes than if they are doing this in class in a school. So a bit about the project itself. The project that I'm talking about, this Paleo project, was started by Dr. Michael Newbury, who worked here at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. And he really wanted to involve the public in science and reach out in terms of science education. And he talked a lot with us, the education staff, about this, and also asking us if, one thing I distinctly remember him asking us, if we were paleontologists, if we thought we were paleontologists. And we said no, we didn't think we were, because we weren't actually conducting research in paleontology. So this way we could sort of collaborate with the kids and with him and all be actually involved in the scientific process. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how the project has changed over time, and then some of the stuff that I learned from my research. So this project involves students collecting data about a fish called Mylodaphis bipartitis, which looks like this. And so this project started in 2011, and Dr. Newbury wanted to learn things about this extinct fossil fish. It's related to modern guitar fish. And so the students were going to look at that. And originally, this species is only known from isolated teeth and vertebrae, so not very good specimens necessarily, but there's thousands of them. So one good thing we have here at the museum is we have an articulated specimen, so a specimen that has basically the whole body there. And we can see the dentition in place, so you can actually look at what the face looks like. And I thought it looked like Jabba the Hutt. So you can actually look at the jaws. So this is looking at the jaws from underneath, so you can see where the teeth are. And there's a few things that Dr. Newbury hopes to learn from their dentition. And one of them is the first project that the kids looked at science camp. So at science camp, this is a project for their senior campers. So usually that's children aged like 13 to 16. Sometimes you'll get 12-year-olds and 17-year-olds, depending on the group. And their group was helping to answer the research question of whether young Mylodaphis lived with the adult Mylodaphis. And so it was, how can we figure that out? And so by looking at the teeth, we may be able to figure that out. And one question that was presented to the kids was, if we find a bunch of small teeth, does that mean that there were babies there? And of course, not necessarily. So because we can look at the articulated specimen, you can look at the jaws and actually see that at some spots there's teeth that are slightly different shapes, that are definitely different sizes. And so you need to look for a specific type of tooth. And so along with this, the students also learned how to formulate a proper hypothesis and how to do hypothesis testing. And this is one that I think is really important, because when you teach a child how to actually properly use like a null hypothesis, then they can learn that a hypothesis is something to reject, but it isn't necessarily that if your data matches your hypothesis, it doesn't mean that that's necessarily 100% true. And so basically learning how the scientific process actually works. And so if they take a certain morphology of tooth, the teeth that all look a certain way, and then measure them, and then by comparing those sizes to living guitar fish, you might be able to figure out which are pups. And Dr. Newbury figured there was a size range of teeth that he thought would be from pups. And then by comparing them, you could see if from this locality the pups and adults were together or not. Some of the issues with the early project was when the students had to select the teeth, there was a lot of rules they had to follow. So they have a step-by-step rules to eliminate teeth. And originally there was 3 rules they would follow, which seemed a little bit too complicated for them. It made it a little bit harder for them to select teeth. Now in 2012, this project was also piloted as a school program. So the idea was to hopefully expand this into a different group of the public, so hopefully get other students involved. And so one thing that was noticed was that at science camp, you have a bunch of really keen kids. They love science, they love paleontology, they're all already pretty knowledgeable in it. So the idea would be that thinking if maybe these kids wouldn't be capable of measuring data that would be necessarily accurate, that we should go with students that are going to be really interested in science. So the project was offered at first, well, and continuing on, specifically to classes at science schools or teachers that we've had at the museum before that are really keen on science, and to paleontology classes in high school. So they were the ones that were asked to participate. And for that first year, there was a day that was designated to work on this project, and 8 students showed up and measured some teeth, but they ended up measuring about 1,000 teeth, sorting through 1,000 teeth. So there's a lot that they could get through if they're interested in it, which is nice. So looking at a lot of different teeth. Now some of the good things to come out of this, one thing was definitely that it got them interested in the scientific process and learning about what they could pursue in university beyond this. So the science educators that led this noted that the kids asked them about their university education and things like that, and that they're actually getting involved in the scientific process is, of course, important. And then in the years that followed, so well, the next year I should say, camp is basically the same. So they did the same project with the 2 rules, seeing if the pups lived with the adults. And again, this is something that's ongoing for several reasons. One, because there's thousands of teeth to work through, and we want to get peer reviews. We want the students to measure teeth from the same locality more than once so that we can make sure we're getting that quality control. And in the school, they were answering the same research question, but the way that the project was conducted was a little bit different. So it became what we call here at the museum an edutaur. So instead of just coming for a day, we asked the schools to come for a sleepover. So in the parts of the edutaur, they did a bunch of different things. One, they would get to go see the Mylodapus specimen, so that articulated specimen I showed. They also would get to learn and participate a bit in screen washing. So screen washing, if you're not familiar, is taking a bunch of matrix, so rock that contains little fossils, and putting it in a tray, and then submersing that in water, and every once in a while shaking it, and then the mud and bits of sediment will fall off of it, and then you'll get just all those microfossils left. And so the idea was so they would see all the steps involved leading up to having the teeth, the isolated teeth. So we have the screen washing, then they would sort through washed matrix. So they'd get after this process, you have a whole bunch of little rocks left and a bunch of little fossils. And so they would sort through that and see what sorts of fossils you would find. And then they would participate in the data collection. So then introduce them to the Mylodapus project and show them how to measure the teeth and why we're doing this, and then they would actually conduct that. And then they would sleep over, and on the second day, they would watch one of our auditorium videos about our scientists, and then have a discussion. So to talk about what they've learned about the scientific process, if that changed their view of scientific research, that sort of thing. And then in 2014, there were some bigger changes. So in the school, we did a completely different project this year. Since Dr. Michael Newbury left, and since we've been doing the Mylodapus project a lot, we wanted to do something new. And so this time we involved Dr. Don Brinkman, our head of research here at the museum. And Don wanted to look at fossil gar. So there's our living gar. Again, a species that we can compare to living species to try and answer questions about them. And so for this one, they were looking again at isolated bits, so looking at the scales of the gar and looking at them from 2 different localities. And looking at those gar scales, trying to decide if there was a difference in those 2 localities. So it appeared, just on first glance, that maybe there was a difference in the sizes of scales at the 2 places. So some of the ones found at Dinosaur Park, for example, seemed to be smaller than the scales at the other locality. And then the next step would be to figure out why that is. So why are they differing? So with the gar scales, we again did some rules of what to measure. So showing them pictures and images. So we were looking basically for a rectangular scale that wasn't broken, so it would be easy to measure. And for some of these, we could still use them because of the way they were measuring them, and I'll show you that in a second. So if it was an incomplete scale, of course we couldn't do any measuring of like the length of the scale, that sort of thing. So the measurements they were taking, when they had a nice rectangular scale like this, they would be measuring the width of the scale, so the width opposite this side that is hooking to the scale beside it. So measuring the width of the scale, and then also measuring the thickness of the scale. So even if the scale was a bit broken, as long as the thickest part was there, they could still potentially measure them. And so we ended up having a school come, a science school, with some of their grade 9 students to participate in this. And they also did peer reviewing, like I was talking about earlier. So after they would measure the teeth, then another group of, they were working in groups of about 3 students. And once one group measured a vial of teeth, another one would measure. So what they have to do first is sort the teeth, just like with the scales, and then measure the good ones, the ones that are the correct morphotype. And then the good part about this EduTour was we got to do a bit of analysis of their data. So with the kids, this is not an actual graph that they made, but I got them to graph their scales. So take, just looking at width at first, so they would count how many scales of a certain width were there, and then make a basic graph of it. And then we talked about this, and we compared the graphs they made for the DPP locality to the 1-4 locality, and asked them, if you just looked at these graphs, can you tell if the one locality has bigger scales than the other? And luckily they did say that no, this wasn't enough. And one of the problems was the graphs they made, I had them round the numbers. So I had them round the widths. So if they had a scale that was 7.5 millimeters wide, that it became 8 millimeters wide. And they recognized that as something that would make errors. Another thing we looked at was correlation between the thickness and width. So we wanted to see if, basically, if as the scale got bigger, if it also got thicker. And so we did comparing the width to the thickness. And for that, I then plotted a few bits of their data and then made sort of a scatter plot, so width against thickness. And then then asked them again, from this graph, can we say if there's a correlation? And maybe you could guess that there was, if there's basically a linear relationship. But to make sure, we also talked a bit about statistics. So we ran a basic statistical test to see if there was correlation. And it did appear that there was. But then I asked them another question, did we measure enough scales to do so? So in the program I was using, you could enter 100 scales. So I asked them if they thought that was enough. And so they recognized that you need a lot of samples to answer a scientific question as well. So from all of these projects, I wanted to see if this was actually, if the data they were getting can be used for research, but also just what the kids learned from this. And so my master's itself only focused on that 2014 camp. And so I conducted a few interviews, like I said, so with museum staff, with camp counselors, and at camp. So the senior camps that did this project, it was in August of this past summer, and there were 66 campers in total, and I did 2 interviews. So the initial interview was before they had actually worked on the project, and for that one I questioned 52 of the campers. The ones that I didn't, it was because their parents chose not to involve them in it. And then after they completed the data collection, I interviewed them again. And I have some fewer kids that time, because I just had time constraints, and so I didn't get quite as many. So to start off with, I questioned some of our staff here at the museum, including a couple of scientists. And one thing I wanted to ask about was the first time they were involved in research. So not the first time they did a lab, because like I mentioned before, a lot of our science courses and classes, the first time you experience an experiment or something, it's something with a definite outcome that's been repeated hundreds, thousands of times. And so this would be their first experience either assisting a researcher or conducting their own research. And all of them said that the first time was during university, so during their undergraduate degrees. And for some, not until like the 4th year of undergraduate. And that was my experience as well. So until you're almost done your degree in science, sometimes you don't really experience research firsthand. And I think that's one thing that's really great about this project, is that the kids can see it even before they're choosing their university career, and maybe that can help them, inspire them to start research projects earlier, or maybe it will tell them that research isn't for them, which I think is valid as well. So some of the benefits that they saw, I liked this, Dr. Don Henderson said this, that they should participate in the data drudgery to get the experience, and that way we're getting help collecting the data. So again, we have a free labor force that's going to collect all the data for the scientists, and then they have all of this that they can go back to. And also the educational experience. Everyone, of course, sees this as a positive, so they're learning about the scientific process while helping us out. But some of the things that were recognized as possible issues, again, is quality control. So do we know if a 13-year-old child can measure these teeth accurately? And remember, these are things that are just millimeters in size, so very small fossils. And so the good thing about our project is that we do have peer reviews, and we do have an expert or an educator who knows what they're doing, always there with them when they're completing these projects. And then it's basically monitoring the project is another issue, and keeping it going. Because one of the problems here is that you may have kids collecting this data in the summer, and then we don't do it again for a year. So there's gaps in when the data is collected as well. In terms of the science camp counselors, some of the things that they brought up, and also with the camp coordinator, Morgan, they again noted that this was exciting to actually involve the students in real science, learning the real scientific process, learning what's involved, seeing that everything isn't just like a linear process from hypothesis to experiment to results, that there's different things that have to be incorporated. And one big thing, like I've mentioned before, is learning how to properly use a hypothesis. So actually testing a hypothesis and learning how to reject it and things like that. And one thing they also noticed was the kids discovering things for themselves or doing things that they didn't expect. So for example, the peer reviews, in the first times that they did this, the kids started peer reviewing on their own and started discussing with each other what the results were. So they already saw the benefit of collaborating and redoing the data, to remeasuring the teeth to make sure they were doing it correctly. Again, some of the drawbacks, there were kids that didn't like the project as much as others, and especially you see it with the younger campers. So if the 12, 13, 14 might not be as keen on doing this for long periods of time. But the good news is, because they're here at the museum with the counselors, they were able to have the younger kids could do it for a while and then go take a break and go in the galleries if they wanted, and the keen eyes would stay on it. So definitely allowing the kids that want to be there to keep measuring them. And then the repetition of the project. So science camp, you'll get kids returning most of the time. You'll get them returning year after year. And so doing the same project, answering the same research question again and again, wasn't always that exciting for them. So some of the things that the science camp counselors would like to see, and the coordinator, is that maybe this could be even expanded, because these kids do get to participate in some field work. They get to do the screen washing and all that sort of thing, maybe some basic fossil preparation to sort of give them the whole view of paleontology, and also conducting their own research. So using these fossils to come up with their own hypothesis and doing some analysis, instead of just straight up measuring the teeth and then sending them away. And they also want these children to be recognized that they are capable of conducting this research and that what they're doing is a good thing. With the campers, I asked them a few different things. I asked them if they had conducted any data, if they'd done any data collecting before. And only 3 of the 52 that I questioned had, and 2 of those had parents that were scientists. One was a chemist and one was an engineer or something. So they had helped them with some of their research. So this is something brand new for them. 25 of the kids were definite that they wanted to pursue a career in science. Some of the other ones weren't sure, of course. And the 12 to 13-year-olds were definitely the ones that 100% wanted to be a paleontologist, and that was definitely going to happen. Some of the older kids had a more, in some cases, realistic view, or they just decided they wanted to be something else, even though they liked science. So one girl knew she wants to be a chef and things like that. So 6 of them definitely weren't in a career of science. Some of the kids had really interesting viewpoints. One boy said he wanted to be a scientist, but he was worried about lack of funding, so he decided maybe he shouldn't do it. So they were thinking about it. One other thing I asked them was what is science? So I asked them what they thought science was, and they got some interesting answers. So one kid said it was hard. Some said things like the meaning of life. Some didn't know, and some said things like epic, it runs the world, which I like that one too. So when I was asking them, I also asked them what they thought of scientific research was, and they didn't necessarily know all of the steps of scientific research or have a firm grasp on that necessarily. So I thought that was important. After they completed the project, I asked them some questions, like if their view of scientific research had changed, things like that. But also I asked them what they liked about the project. They said a few different things. One kid said they liked the magnifying glasses that they got to look at the fossils under. But some of them also mentioned they liked being able to look at fossil fish at what they viewed would be a dinosaur camp, so sort of the variety of things. Liked looking at fossils, liked that they were actually helping a scientist, so they definitely enjoyed working on the project. Some of my concerns from observing them, and also some of the concerns the children voiced, was again that idea of finding the correct answer. There was a lack of understanding in some aspects of the project, and one thing that I noticed was that the counselors didn't go into a great deal of depth in the introduction to Mylodapus because most of the kids were returning to camp. And they didn't get to see the articulated specimen this year either. But for the new kids, I really felt that was a little bit detrimental to them since they didn't completely understand the research project necessarily. And one girl who was, I believe, 17, who had been to camp many times during my interview, voiced concern that she didn't completely understand the research question. So I told her it again, and then she was okay with it. But they definitely wanted to know what the research was about so that there was a purpose to what they were doing. I also asked some of them, because I was curious with the new kids, if they understood what they were doing. So I asked them what Mylodapus was, and most of them could tell me, which I found good. They did understand what was happening. One kid looked at me really puzzled and was like, a fish? And didn't really know. But most of them were good that way, but still a little bit of a concern. And again, repetition. So the kids didn't mention that doing this same project over and over, they would like to get something a little bit different. Another thing, I asked them if they've ever received feedback, if they know if they've ever received feedback on the research being done, that sort of thing. And they basically said not really. So when they come back to camp, they might get told a little bit about what's happening, but they're not really getting told what their research is being used for. They definitely understood the importance of what they were doing, and they agreed that if they had to do this sort of research for their undergraduate degree or for their own research as a scientist, they would be willing to do this sort of data collection again. Again, that same girl that I was mentioning, the 17-year-old, she mentioned that she was excited for when she became a scientist and she got to force other young people and her grad students to do this for her. And she also mentioned she would not ever be researching Mylodapus. She knew that too. So the repetition, they do not necessarily like that. And I think that's to be expected. But again, they were willing to do it. She was one that stayed extra time to keep measuring under the microscope teeny, teeny, tiny teeth. So even though she said that, she was still wanted to be a part of the process and wanted to conduct this research. Now, the big important thing, I wanted to see if the data these kids are collecting was actually accurate. And one of the problems, so I conducted a few different tests on theirs. Most of what I was doing was actually comparing the peer reviews. So looking at, for some cases, there would be 3 groups of kids that measured the same set of teeth, and then comparing those to see if there's any variation between them. And one of the problems is that we have done this project many times, but in some cases there's not a lot of peer reviews, and we haven't always gone back to them. But the good news is that these fossils aren't going anywhere. They're not going to rot away. They aren't moving animals or anything. And so we can go back to them and measure them as experts even to then compare that against them. So there's still more work to be done in that case. And so what I did mainly was compare, this is sort of after the fact, I compared the 2014 GAR project the students did in the school editour to the Mylodapus project of 1 year at science camp. And I chose those 2 because they were different, and those were the ones I had there was the most peer review, most data for. And so what I found was the Mylodapus project, the science campers, their data seems to be good. It's really accurate. And the peer reviews, when you look at those, comparing them, there's not much variation. So they seem to be coming to the same conclusions. And with the GAR, there were some issues, so they weren't quite as accurate. And one of the things that I think is a problem is when they're selecting the teeth or the scales. So it's not so much the measuring. The measurements seem, because we observe them and check if they're doing it correctly, they seem to be measuring them all right. It's whether they're picking a broken scale and measuring it, or a tooth that's not the correct morphology or something. And that's, again, something we can keep checking since we're with them when they're measuring it, but there's, of course, going to be still some errors that slip in there. And I also would like to sort of look more into why there's a difference between them. So what about the GAR project was different than the Mylodapus? But the problem is there's a lot of things that were different about it. So the kids who were doing it, it was in a different atmosphere. Like, it's like they were at school. They got brought here with their school. They conducted their research in the evening after they had already done a bunch of other activities. So maybe they were tired. Maybe the rules we set for the GAR scales weren't quite as clear maybe as the Mylodapus. But one thing that I felt important in my research was that the accuracy isn't the only thing that's important. So the accuracy, of course, is important if we want to actually use this data, but that doesn't negate the educational experience for the kids or any of the other benefits that we have coming out of it. So one big thing that I also noticed was because they didn't get any follow-up. So we may be wondering, do the pups live together? Does the GAR scales differ? And of course, we're not going to know that right away, and the kids realized that. But I think they need to get some feedback in order to know that what they're doing is going to actually be used. So if that means just an email of some early results, or just knowing that we're continuing the project and that sort of thing. Because, for example, like the GAR scales, all we've done is those 2 sets of it in October. So there's not enough there to draw any conclusions yet. But it's still nice to tell them that this is actually being used. This wasn't done in vain. So the basic benefits that I see with this is that some of this is usable data. The science camp are producing measurements that can actually be used for scientific research, I think. Also, just the basic scientific outreach. So there isn't very often that the public gets to be this involved in the scientific process and learn that science is still happening. And again, to realize that there's no distortion in this, that this is straight up what's actually happening in science. And getting the kids their first research experience, which again, like I mentioned, most people don't get that until university. And this way, maybe when they go into university in their first year, they might be more confident in approaching a scientist to help them or to conduct their own research earlier on and just give them that extra leg up when it comes to that. And of course, that then we have all this data that can be collected, thousands and thousands of samples that we can potentially use in research. Some of the things that I think we can work on or that maybe can stay the same, I think based on just observing the students at camp and then the students collecting the GAR measurements, that they need to really be keen on it. When you're looking at this small of fossils, when it's this specific detailed project, I definitely think that the kids need to want to be there. And I think that may have hindered the GAR scale project. That may be why the accuracy isn't quite there. And so I think that's something that has to keep happening. And so when I went into this, I hoped that I would get to say that we could expand this a bunch of ways because I want everyone to be able to do this. But I don't think that really young children could do this, of course. Maybe a different kind of project, but not this. And definitely there's more statistical analyses that need to be done. So we could look at whether the younger campers, so those 13 to 14-year-olds, if their accuracy is different than the 15 to 16-year-olds, that sort of thing. And look at the years that had a bunch of rules for selecting the teeth versus just one and that sort of thing. Also, another thing that would be great is if the students came up with their own hypotheses. So looking at similar types of fossils, but coming up with their own sort of idea for research. I think that could really be beneficial, especially at science camp for returning campers to then they've done this for a few years, they know how it works, and then they can do it themselves. And maybe to come up with a little bit of a new twist on it, move away from Mylodapus, and maybe even focus, this project maybe could be expanded to something that's not necessarily microfossils every time, even though that one is the one that is obviously has benefits for both them and for us since we get all of this data that we can use. And again, that they need feedback. So we need to be telling these kids what we're using their research for, involving them in the end results as well. That way they know that there's actually a point to this. And you want them to see the steps all the way through, not just the beginning. Another thing, again, like I said, I don't think that this can work as a public sort of drop-in thing, which I would love it if more people could be involved. But I think it's important that we're telling people about this, telling us people that the public can be involved directly in science, and that maybe that can get us more support. So the issues I would see with expanding this to involve other people is, again, the inaccuracy of the data. If they aren't keen on it, if they aren't really interested, it probably won't be usable. Doesn't mean it's not helpful for them to participate for themselves, but the issue with that is that with these tiny specimens, we don't want to have them mishandled or to lose them and things like that. So I think there's a couple issues with that, with the particular material we're using. So if we're using tiny microfossils, I don't think that will work. But again, if we are telling everyone about this, if we have more students participating in camp and things, it's still a way to reach out to the public about science. And I also want to thank a bunch of people. I especially want to thank Dr. Newbury for helping me a lot with my master's, but also for coming up with this project, and Morgan Sievertson, our camp coordinator, and his counselors for all their excellent work. And of course, the camp kids were the biggest help to me, so I'm very glad they helped me. And that's the end. Thank you.